All right, I'm going to hit record. And for the sake of some of you who may be joining us on this recording, I'll just remind you that today is Tuesday, October the 27th. That's hard to believe, but that's the date. And I am really thrilled and honored to have with us today Jescelle Major. It's hard to describe who she is because she's so many different things, but it's really wonderful to have you here, Jescelle. Thank you so much for joining us today. I want to give you kind of a little bit of background, all you students, just to kind of give you some context. As you may recall, we've had the opportunity to interview 3 of the people that participated in a very historic conversation this last summer. And it was all recorded for posterity and hopefully for some using it as some kind of a catalyst for change in our profession and beyond. It's this article that's called The Twin Pandemics, where 7 professional landscape architects and 1 architect spoke about a series of issues concerning our profession and kind of the design profession in general, and looking at it within the context of the COVID pandemic, but also this other pandemic of kind of systemic racism in our society and our culture, especially here in America, but around the world, obviously, as well. And it was such a magnificent and poignant conversation, and when I read it, I was telling Jescelle earlier that I didn't actually pick up that article in Landscape Architecture magazine till I'd already invited Diane Jones-Allen to be part of this. So when I picked it up, I was like, oh my gosh, this is like this gold mine. So it's been a real thrill to be able to talk with Diane, with Kennedy, and with Doug Williams, who actually used to teach in our program here at A&T. And has gone on to get a PhD and do other amazing things. So this morning we have the honor to have Jescelle Major with us, who I'm guessing was probably the youngest person to participate in that conversation. She's around 30, and most everybody else was 30 plus. So I think it's going to be really helpful for you all. I hope it is, to be able to kind of hear a different perspective. And in particular, some of the amazing things that she's been doing in part as a result of COVID and being able to not work as full time as she would like to in the job that she has out in Seattle, right, Martrell? Or, I mean, sorry, Jescelle.
Yeah, perfect.
So as and you can read all this in kind of the bio that I put together in the Blackboard site for the class and for today's lecture number 11. But I wanted to start out, as we often do with these conversations each Tuesday, to ask Jescelle to share just a little bit of your journey with us, kind of personally and professionally. And it seems like a great segue in the sense that you've also spoken really poignantly about how it seems like at this time in history, that because of the pandemic, these twin pandemics, there is kind of a meeting of a lot of the professional things in your life and the personal things in your life. So I think that would be a nice way to sort of transition into, okay, here's how I got where I am, and here's where I'm thinking, here's where I'm kind of heading. So Jescelle, you have the floor, and I'm going to also ask that you students take notes, please. And in particular, if something of interest comes up in your mind, to write down any kind of question you have, sir, for Jescelle, because we'll be able to kind of interact with one another. So Jescelle, thank you again for being with us. If you wouldn't mind just giving us some background, that'd be fantastic.
Sure. Thank you all for having me in your class this morning. I have to totally give you some compliments for managing to be design student in COVID on the internet. I think I would have a really hard time with that. I mean, even for this morning, I have to be in my bedroom because it's the only place I show up well on camera. So I think there's sort of a lot of struggles there. So congrats on that. And I'm not going to share slides with you or anything like that because I thought it would be more valuable if we could just sort of have a conversation. And I was sort of saying in preparation for this that it's something that I wish I would have had as a student. We always sort of saw the same sort of practitioner tell us about the same sort of thing. And if you wanted to be the type of landscape architect that worked at a big name firm and was pushing forward, like the traditional design innovation, we had all of the resources for that. But if you wanted to sort of take a different path or even understand what other paths were available, that was much harder, and you had to sort of self-engineer and sort of use your own zeal to find those. So I'm glad that we're here, and that's sort of a little bit of background on why I'm not presenting to you, but would rather just have a little chat. So that's correct. I do live in Seattle, so it's still morning here, early in fact, and I'm pretty far away from all of my roots. So I am originally from Miami. I lived there birth and all the way through high school, and then I stayed in Florida for my undergrad degree, and I went to University of Florida. So I was a Florida girl for quite some time.
Go Gators.
Yeah, go Gators.
That's where I got my bachelor's degree in landscape architecture.
Go Gators. And then I also have to say go Tigers because I got my landscape degree from LSU. And then from Louisiana, I had about 2 weeks after graduation before I moved cross country. So it was a little bit of leapfrogging. In Miami, I went to a really small public K through, they're K through 12 now. At that time, they just went through middle school. So I had the same friends, the same sort of teachers, and it was a lovely place, and it was a great place to learn, and it was also extremely white. And I think at the peak, I maybe had 2 other Black students in my class, and that would have been like an extraordinary year. And I think that's part of why I lean towards like PWIs for undergraduate studies. And so it's really cool to be talking to you all, and I would love to know more about how you sort of landed where you are. And then from Cushman, I always knew that I liked art, and most students from there tried to find either another private school to go to or some sort of specialized public school. And I don't know if you have a similar thing in North Carolina, but we have magnet schools in Florida, and they're it's a all public school. You do have to apply to get in, and they usually have a different focus. So I chose to apply to design and architecture senior high, and it's a pretty unique program, even nationwide. I think even among magnet schools, you sort of pick a design concentration in your sophomore year, and you carry that through graduation. And I picked architecture at the time, and it's a unique program because it's a block schedule, so you have all of your academic courses. You also have to do fine arts courses, and then you take your design class. And architecture is a partnership with Florida International University, so you are taking college level studios while you're still in high school, which is pretty cool because one, you get to transfer those credits to university, which is quite a cost savings. And also you get a little bit more prepared from the fine arts and from the architecture studio to what sort of critique is like, standing up to a jury, what that's like, not sleeping. You sort of know what that's like early on as well. And so that made the transition to university a little bit easier. And I got to University of Florida, and I thought, oh, I'm definitely going to be an architect. That's what I just spent all this time in high school studying. And then I met the architects, and I was like, oh, I don't know about you guys. I feel that way today still. You have great intentions, but I'm not sure if you're ever getting where I want you to go. And at that time, the university had just launched 2 sustainability degrees. And one of them was in the design, construction and planning college. And I thought that seemed much more like me. It was still with all of the designers. I still got to take design classes. I still got to think in that way. But it was much more broad. We had to think about sustainability culturally and environmentally, and economically, which are not always things that you do traditionally in a design program. And you also got to customize your curriculum in a way that I found really interesting. And so you kind of have these categories that you have to study, but you kind of get to pick what courses fulfill that. And I think that's kind of a pattern I've continued in my professional life as well. Like, give me the prescription, but let me sort of think about the ways I want to achieve that. And maybe they're traditional, and maybe they are coming at it from a little bit of a different angle. So while I was at University of Florida, I sort of crunched all of my studies together so that I could essentially, I definitely graduated a semester early, but I kind of finished a year early, and that I got to return back to Miami in my final year to do my capstone project. And I also got to start working. So I was working a year before I went on to grad school. And when I was going to grad school, I actually wasn't completely sure what I wanted to study. I knew I wanted to pick a design discipline. At that time, when you told somebody you studied sustainability, they were like, cool, 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 what's that? And I would say some of that persists, but people are a little bit more aware of it, but it made it pretty hard to find the right job because people knew it was important, but weren't always sure what that meant in terms of job skills, whereas once you align with a profession, it's a little more clear. Of course, I picked landscape architecture, which is the least clear of the disciplines, and still a little bit gray and nebulous. But I think it was the program I was most excited about of all of the ones that I sort of was choosing from. And I also got an assistantship to go to LSU. So I sort of accepted my slot there and my assistantship before I had even been to Baton Rouge. So it's kind of a sight unseen.
Excuse the interruption, but I
Yeah.
just want to go back for a second because 12 of the 15 students in this class are seniors, and next semester they're going to be doing their capstone, and they're taking a course right now in writing proposals, and one of the assignments for that class is to write a proposal for their capstone. I wonder if you could just share a little bit about your selection of a capstone project, maybe a little bit about what that was and how you apparently kind of worked that into some kind of a job situation as well, which always sounds good. Could you just share a little bit of that, please?
So I sort of realized how much our capstone was going to be, and so I wanted to pick a site and a topic that I knew I could love for the entire time. And I also wanted to pick something. I think there's two ways to go. There's either you could be really exploratory in it and give yourself a chance to study something you wouldn't otherwise. And I sort of went the opposite way and picked a place I knew really well. I was like, I'm going home. I'm going to study home. And that was because then I didn't have to spend so much time in the analysis and uncovering of what this place is. I knew the place, and it was more getting to the problem, because I just think that's the hardest part about capstone, is like getting to an end in a short period of time. And so taking on a question that's too big is years worth of work, and we just didn't have that. So I was like, I'm gonna save myself some time and pick this place I really know. And it also felt rewarding that sort of when I wrapped up my capstone, I had this thing that I thought could be a tool for people who lived in the city or worked for the city or were, even just a neighbor. Here's some things I've been thinking about, and you could carry them on. And sort of, I'm a hometown person, so I'm not just sort of telling you any sort of thing. I've really invested in it, and I work here, and my family still lives here, that kind of thing. So I wanted those layers to be present in my capstone work. So the project was called Lost and Found, and it was sort of born out of this idea that sustainability is costly, and a lot of times people who have either, like, the highest electricity bill or the longest journey to work are the people who could least afford it. And so I looked at very similar neighborhoods across scales to say this one's thriving and is doing, like, the culture is really present, but also they're doing more things sustainably or have more supports for the community. And it's right next to this other community of the same scale. And so what's working here and what's not working in this other one. So I compared like a downtown neighborhood, a residential neighborhood, and a historically white and historically black neighborhood of the same scale as well, to just sort of look at those factors to see what was being maintained, what wasn't, and were there some things that the culture or the vernacular design could offer in the way of sustainability that was cheap. Like, were there already things that people were doing or could be doing that isn't all of a sudden going to a full solar roof, or could the environment and could history of Miami sort of tell you what the urban form and sustainable choices should be. And because I went back to Miami, I got to involve students from my old high school. So they looked at a smaller scale on some tiny home projects that sort of, in theory, could be placed into my framework. So it was a cool way to give back to students at that time and see what they were thinking about, and also just sort of expand the breadth of my own project. And then I also took on, and throughout the years, some version of an internship or a job. I've done both for Parks and Rec. So I got to look at that scale in the same place, and that was kind of some of how I was approaching the analysis for my capstone. So I got to get some professional experience, bolster my own capstone project, and report back to the students in high school. So it was kind of a cool way to set it up for me. And it also became an early version of what was my then graduate thesis. So I didn't know I was doing the work for it then, but I kind of.
What I love about that story so much, Jescelle, is that I always think of landscape architecture as the profession that connects all the dots. And it's like, that's who you are, like connecting all these things, and even going back to your old high school and saying, yeah, that's a resource. I just think that's a beautiful story of how you've connected all those things together and been so entrepreneurial in your approach to even your capstone project. Congratulations.
And also capstone, I mean, I won't tell you what your experience will be, but it was one of my favorite parts of the program, honestly. Like, I finally got to study what I cared about and not whatever Professor so-and-so was really in love with. And I think you get to be proud of it in a different way, and really you can sort of shape it to what you think you might want to do professionally and use that as a tool, whether that's in an interview or in even some jobs. You write your own job description, and maybe it's sort of rooted in what you've investigated in your capstone. So, and then if there's a skill that you just haven't had time to really invest in a way, like maybe you're really into graphics and you haven't had a studio for that, or you really want to spend some more time on the technical side or on the engagement side because you're sort of the driver there, you can invest more deeply in that. And I also think, I'm not entirely sure how you all set it up, but it was really important for me to think about who was advising me and what other professionals and professors I could be engaging in my capstone. And then it sort of started a professional network for me. It felt much easier to be like, hey, can I talk to you a little bit about this capstone project I'm doing, than a cold call of, I just want to know what you do and it would be nice to meet you. So it was like an easy way to talk to people and get that networking going. So it was my favorite part of undergrad for sure.
Just as a little side note, I teach another class besides this one in master planning, And because of COVID and not knowing where people were going to be, and it just didn't seem to make sense that everybody'd work on the same project. The first assignment in the semester was to start making calls and reaching out to professionals to find a project that you could work with in concert with a practicing professional. I don't know that it went as well as I hoped it would, but it occurs to me now that it's wonderful that you were reaching out not just to other professors but also to other professionals to say, hey, I want some input here. Could you be part of my team? I think that's a beautiful notion, and another way to help students connect in with practicing professionals to get that kind of input and support.
Yeah, I think you have to be your best advocate and totally hustle in that way. I think when you talk to a lot of designers who are doing what you would want to be doing, when you find out they had to ask for something, like they had to ask for it or make it for themselves, it's really hard to just stumble upon or into the right role in that way. So as much as networking is work, it's really important in this field, especially because I don't want to overgeneralize, but I think people are still, or society is still surprised that people of color can do things and do them well and maybe better or in a new way than they were thinking about. And so you have to get yourself sort of in those rooms to show people that, and not just in a gotcha, told you so kind of way, but just like really let them see your energy and your work ethic and let that then sort of take you somewhere.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about LSU and how that led you to your work out in Seattle.
Yeah, LSU was great. It was interesting because I really loved my time at University of Florida, but I really hated Gainesville. And when I got to Baton Rouge, I was like, oh, cool. This is what it's like to like your city and like the school, not just one. And it was, I'm sure North Carolina is perfect for learning landscape architecture, but for me at the time, Louisiana felt like this quintessential place to study landscape just because every sort of issue was highly present there, whether it was poverty or wealth or government operations and corruption to political spheres and design and every kind of environmental crisis that you wanted, flooding, subsidence, land loss, hurricane, you name, drought, whatever you name it. And so it was kind of cool to be in a place that needed landscapes help in every sort of way. And I think some cities really know who they want to be when they grow up. And I think, especially in terms of environmentalism and landscape architecture, and I think Louisiana still is defining it and figuring it out. And that's kind of cool to be studying in a place where you can see your impact because it's still sort of new and accepting of ideas in a way that, like Seattle that I've moved to, is much more decided, and so it's much more a contribution than it is a authoring of a place. So that was cool. I think when I was in the program, it was so easy to be very stressed and overwhelmed and unsure, like, is this the right thing, and what is my job going to be, and how am I going to pay back these loans? And I think I asked some of those questions even still, but I realized that in advocating for the experience I wanted in school, I was so much more prepared to do that in the workplace. And so things that I found to be a challenge when I was a student, I'm like, oh, well, now that I'm working, I have seen how that plays out. I know what that is like, and I'm sort of more prepared when I'm in an office. So practicing there, I think, is really helpful. And I also, you get to be so much more imaginative or it's encouraged when you're a student, and you have to encourage others when you start working. And so if you really take that energy and remember what that feels like, I think it becomes much more important for you to do that when you are working professionally. So I say that to say there was a lot of things that I was critical about when I was a student, and now in retrospect, I can see how they were helpful, even if that wasn't the intent. And again, I decided to be a thesis track student, which you didn't have to do. You could have done just a final studio. And I picked back up where I left off for my capstone project. And I also used that as the time to build relationships across disciplines with different types of professionals and professors, because I knew that I wanted to be able to lean on some of those people professionally. So, for example, Austin Allen was my thesis advisor, who was married to Diane Allen, who all of a sudden I was in Landscape Architecture magazine with. So I think I think really diving into some of that is important. And they don't just know me by name or because they were like Googling who's a Black person in landscape. They could speak to my work because I had involved them in it. So that was pretty cool. Louisiana was good. And then had some strange requirements for where I wanted to go next. After experiencing Baton Rouge Airport, I was like, great, I really need an international airport now. I wanted to move to a city. I wanted there to be public transit that was actually reliable and connected in a way that I hadn't been exposed to. I wanted recycling to be just kind of part of the nature of the place I was going to live, and not this one-off project that some store was doing in Baton Rouge. And I wanted professional sports and all of these things. So I think most people pick where they're going to go because it's really about the job and the firm, but I was really concerned about the place that I wanted to be impacting and impacted by. So that's where I sort of picked a list of cities, and then I picked firms that I thought aligned with what I wanted, and that's how I ended up moving, again, sort of like Louisiana, sight unseen. I accepted a job and showed up in Seattle and was like, hopefully I like it here. And I did, and I do. I'm still here. It's 5.5 years later. And I think that became really important for me because I wasn't just here for a job, I was here for a place. And so when the job gets hard, just like school does, there's some other things that you're taking value from in other areas of your life. And I got really invested in the city and in extracurriculars and all of those things, following the same model of the capstone or the thesis, so that I had networks and people who challenged ideas and were just willing to talk through something. And you don't have crits set up anymore, so you kind of have to do that for yourself. And having it be really place-based, I think, makes a hard day at work easier because you have those other things.
My recollection is that you make some mention in the Twin Pandemics article about not very many Black people in the place where you work, or even in the place where you live. Is that part of your experience too?
Yes. It's kind of like the Cushman School all over again, except I don't go home to Black people either because all of my family is still East Coast. They would like to be diverse, I think, as a city, but it is not. And so I think you'll find that the profession is like that anywhere you go, but you at least, I think there's like a community outside of that you can plug into. And here that's much harder. But we are here just in smaller numbers, so it's not that you don't get to explore that idea at all. But I think it's kind of a living example of what you're hoping to do, in that how do I want to phrase what I'm trying to say? I think you always hope that no matter if there's only a few people of color or it's the most diverse community, that design can have an impact and that you still matter, and that there's still value in the work that you're doing, even if the community is small. And Seattle's an example of that. You can see it. I mean, the work is even maybe sometimes more important. And so there are some upsides, but I would say, yeah, it's a very white profession in a very white city, and it makes it even harder to get progress for people of color, and especially Black people, because even when we do get into like who has some melanin, the smallest number of those are Black people.
Yeah. I'd like to talk a little bit, kind of poke around a little bit about I'm trying to piece a few things together, but it sounds like you worked with kind of a policy oriented firm for a number of years that was interdisciplinary, and that a lot of what you did was the public outreach part of that. But then it also sounds like maybe you're not there now and you're in a new place, and in the process of being in this new place, you're also finding that you have more time to start thinking more broadly about what you'd like to do on your own, and have started this Well Outside thought lab. So I'd like to hear a little bit about that story in terms of kind of how you've progressed in your practice there in Seattle, and especially kind of how that started to open up. I was noticing in some of your initial thoughts that you shared in the Twin Pandemics article that you talked about how these two parts of your life all of a sudden seemed like they were starting to like come together in a new way. So I'd kind of like to open that up a little bit and hear some of your thoughts about your experience over the last couple of years.
Sure. So when I moved out to Seattle, I took a job at Bethune, which is a interdisciplinary firm. They have architecture, interior design, urban design, and landscape architecture. And I was on the landscape architecture team and sometimes the urban design team, because that was a little bit less rigid. And
how many people are in that firm there in Seattle?
At the time I was there, I think we were around 100, maybe, somewhere in there.
In one office.
In the one office.
And then do you have other offices around the country or the world?
At the time that I worked there, there was also a San Francisco office. They were smaller, maybe in the 40-ish range, and since I've left, they also have an LA office. But the landscape team was the smallest team in there. So while it was a large firm, the landscape team, for most of my time there, was around 20. So I guess that's kind of on the larger end of a landscape firm, but it's not the biggest. And so it's a little bit of all of those things where you're like in a bigger office, but you're in a smaller or medium-sized team.
And are any of the principals landscape architects, or is it more dominated by other professions and landscape architecture is a side note? Just curious.
It is not a side note there. It's definitely integrated. There's principals that are landscape architects who lead the team, and then there's also partners who are landscape architects and people on the board of the firm who are landscape architects from both, well, at the time, both offices. I don't think LA has a landscape principal still, but they were pretty integral to leadership in the firm. And I would say the one difference is that most landscape firms are nimble enough to go after a project, whether they prime it or they sub for the architecture. And in an interdisciplinary firm where the architecture arm is the largest, you wouldn't go after a project with a different architect. So there's some work that might have been interesting, but we weren't the architect on it, so the landscape team wouldn't go after it. So it would either be a project where you were working with the architects on the team or where you were priming and it didn't have much of an architecture component at all. And so I guess that's the difference between working in a multidisciplinary office like that versus a standalone landscape operation where you kind of can go after any project irrespective of who the architect is.
Yeah. And then have you changed to a new firm?
Yeah, so I worked there for 3.5 years, and then I think when I started working there, it was really the perfect place for me to launch my career because I got to see all of the different types of practice that were happening. We had pretty diverse projects, and I got to have people ask me for my opinion right away, which I don't think happens in all offices to new people. And I think over time, I just became a little more siloed. I also had been expanding my volunteerism at that time a ton, and I was really interested in the policy side of community work. And I also realized I was spending a ton of time with my computer when I maybe would have liked to be interacting with people a little bit more. And so I started looking for a different job, and I saw this position that was hiring. It's called Burke Consulting. I still work there, just at part-time. And it's a policy and planning firm, so there's a team that works on economics, a team that works on traditional urban planning, land use planning kind of work, to more strategic planning work and evaluation, and a GIS analysis team. So there was just so many different options there, but they were hiring for a community outreach associate at the time, and I was like, oh, that sounds like me. I can think about the design things, I can work at the planning scale, and I can talk to people again. So I sort of transitioned into that role. And I spend a lot of time working on a range of projects. I think because I had the landscape background, we went after more work that was about, they're called PROS plans, or Parks, Recreation, and Open Space plans. And most municipalities have to have one if they want to qualify for grant funding, which is hugely important. And so we do a lot of that work now, and it was kind of a cool moment for me to get to go back to working in parks, which I had done in my work at Miami, and do it think about the policy side of things and talk to people in different communities about what they wanted and what they had access to. And I think through that kind of work, I get to deal with the most diverse parts of Seattle, while still, light. It's at least more than I was doing in a traditional firm. When you just think about like who has the dollars to hire a firm like that, it's usually not the little community, and those are the communities I get to talk to now. But because of COVID, a few of us had to reduce our time, and it makes sense that the person doing community outreach in a time where community is being really safe and distant and all of those things, my role has changed a bit. And that's when I sort of decided, okay, well, dentists still do, and I do have these skills, and what's my protest going to be? And it wasn't marching for me. It was, I'm going to build a business, and I'm going to own something, and I'm going to start to monetize all of the things that I do for free. And building on the work that I do at Burke, it's a little bit different when I'm doing in my own company while outside, because I get to focus on equity in a way that's comfortable to me, and it's not something that a municipality or a firm like ours would tackle, and I get to do that now in my own work. And so I'm doing both things. I'm working in my company and I'm working in Burke, and Burke is great at working really locally and regionally, and while outside, actually, my first client was MVVA, so it was like hopping back to the other coast primarily to do work, and a chance to bring these new skills that I've gotten through working and volunteering and more the policy side back to a more design focused audience. So that's been pretty cool too, to sort of connect the dots back for myself.
Yeah.
So that's sort of what I meant when I was saying all these things were coming together at once. It was like all of the things that we were protesting about, or that society was just finally reckoning with, somehow they just got the message. And it was an economic thing for me, like a response to COVID and how that was affecting work for me. And so that's sort of what I meant when I said it's personal and it's professional and it's all colliding at one time.
That's awesome. So the work that you're doing with MBVA, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like part of that is sort of exploring ways to provide opportunities for people of color to get into experiences within the professional realm. Is that part of what you're doing?
Yeah, definitely. So it was sort of around the time that everybody had a black square and didn't know what it meant. And some firms, like I will give MVVA credit, were really interested in meaning that, and also I think they had already been doing some work in that space, but didn't know how to capture it and speak about it and use that as a launching pad without feeling like they were just saying we do that already. So I think that's some of the work that I've been doing, is thinking about how you could capitalize on what you've already been doing and what you need to do in addition to that to make workspace and offices think about their internal community that they're impacting design, and how they could put that into their business model. So I think they're working on that now, and other firms are too, and it's been interesting for me to think about the policy side and the internal client and the external client, and all the way down to pipeline things, because I think a lot of firms, I won't put them in that bucket, but a lot of firms are like, okay, well, we'll just go hire a bunch of Black people now. And you have to remind them, like, who is this bunch of Black people that you're talking about? Like, that you're just going to go hire, and have you supported any of them in school and university, and have you had conversations or recruitment? And even beyond that, have you talked to anybody in high school? Because everybody didn't go to JASH, and do they know what landscape architecture is to even go to study it to then end up in your office? So I think some of those conversations or realizations firms are coming around to, and I think I'm trying to explain that to them or uncover it.
So I'm assuming that maybe this is starting to open doors with other larger firms as well, not just MBBA, and you're starting to. Wow, that's so cool. So this was something I wanted to get to more towards the end, but because there's so many amazing big picture things that you've also brought up in your article and in the materials that I've shared with the students about well outside. But since we're here, I wanted to just dig in a little bit and share the backstory with our students about the fact that when you said, yes, I'd be happy to speak with your class, you also said, and by the way, it's a beautiful ask that Chris and Steve and the other full-time faculty members are asking of mostly larger firms in this program that we've called Diversity by Design, and it's a bigger than just us, but it's kind of how we've interpreted it. And I'm somewhat peripheral to it because I'm not a full-time faculty, but I've been around since 2006, so I'm part of some of those conversations in terms of, okay, we've not done very well in terms of connecting our students to practicing professionals, and so here's an opportunity. In the same way that you said it in the twin pandemics, it's kind of like, okay, can we capitalize on this? I've heard one person describe it as the pandemic of possibility, which I kind of like, because it's like, okay, it's providing some space for a lot of us to be able to sort of take a step back and say, okay, this is how we've been doing it, but there's a lot that we're missing, and there's ways that we can do much better. And part of it is, I don't know how much you know about our program, but Perry Howard was the first Black president of ASLA on the national level, and he ran our program for, I don't know, 30 years, something like that. He's retired, but he's still also part of the Diversity by Design and some of the other things that we're doing. We've set up, or we were in the process of setting up an advisory committee, I'll call it, of folks from mostly around the state, but other people maybe like you or Diane or, who knows, to say, okay, how do we do this? How do we do this better? So for the sake of our students who are listening in on this conversation, I've invited you and the woman that you're working with at was it MBVA to please help us and suggest other folks who can help us see a bigger picture of how to do this. And I think a lot of it is going to be what you've already been modeling throughout your academic career and your professional career in terms of connecting dots and being very entrepreneurial and learning how to ask and how to ask well and in a way that opens doors. So anyway, I'd like to hear a little bit more about your thoughts on that, and if you have anything that's come to mind over the last 24 hours in terms of how because the question, let me just say specifically, your question was great, and by the way, most of our seniors have been placed at this point, I think, which is great, but there's also a whole set of juniors that have not yet been placed in internships. And your specific point was, well, that's great, but when you're asking not only for an internship that's well paid, but also maybe a stipend so that if it is in New York City or San Francisco or wherever that our students can actually afford to live there for a summer or a semester or whatever. And not every firm can afford to do that. So there's sort of a scale or some kind of a continuum of different ways that we can help our students plug in and be successful in making those kinds of networking connections and that sort of thing. So do you have any thoughts on that? Sorry, that was a really long intro.
Yeah, I do have some thoughts. I would say I think the program, as an outsider, is off to a good start. Like, I know not just in BVA, but other firms are interested. Like, I have friends at other firms that are talking about, like, oh yeah, we're going to take a student and that kind of thing. So I think that's working well. I would say that some firms are very clued in, and we've had conversations about like the reality of the stipend, and everybody doesn't live here, and some people have family and responsibilities, and it's a bigger thing for them to take on an internship, and they are willing to step up. And I would say some firms can't do that, but every firm doesn't know that they need to. So in your process, I would feel like it's worth it to have that conversation instead of feeling afraid that you're going to lose the opportunity if you bring up the fact that you need help or support or your life looks a little bit different. I think have that conversation, that's more worth it. And I also think expand on what an internship could be or could look like for yourself. When think about really what's the job that you want to do, and then you can think about what are different internship opportunities you could take that could benefit you in that job. And maybe that's not name brand. I would say like most students in my class, undergrad and grad, took internships that were kind of name brand and fancy and flashy, and I was like, cool, I'm gonna work for the city. And people were a little bit like, why would you do that when you could work at this firm and that kind of thing? But it turns out, well, now I did that and I get to use that on my resume, and now I work at a policy firm. Or I interned at the zoo when everybody else was looking for, a more traditional internship, and that was paid because the zoo could afford to do it in a way that other firms couldn't, and I got that experience. So I think looking for what you want to get out of the internship is equally as important, if not more, and you can still use that to speak to your experience and to build your portfolio in a way that's sometimes even better than you would in a standard role, unless that's what you would like to do for your job, and then I would prioritize that. Like if you want to, but I think taking on a diversity of internship opportunities or or even a job, like a professional opportunity, that isn't completely the first thing you would think about for landscape architecture, informs landscape architecture, because we really are that kind of profession that's working at that mediator scale, and understanding all of these systems is important.
Wow, that's so helpful. I mean, it's kind of like the difference between one size fits all. Like, okay, here's this big company, and you're gonna go there, and you're gonna learn whatever it is they're gonna teach you, versus each individual being a little more in the driver's seat of, well, what is it you're really interested in, and how can we, maybe as a faculty or whatever, as a group of people who really care about our students being successful, how can we pay a little more attention to what is it that you're really interested in, and how can we help you hook up to that, as opposed to, well, this is it. This is your opportunity, take it or leave it kind of thing.
Yeah, I think have a goal, either a skill you want from your internship, or a lesson you want to learn from your internship, or a place you want to explore from your internship, and like let that be your rubric. Because I think no matter where you intern, your first day of work is going to be terrifying because it's a different place. And so you can't learn everything you need to know about working and about a firm from another firm. It's different anywhere. But you can say, I really want to know about construction details, and that matters at any place that you work. Or I really want to work on my presentation skills, and that matters anywhere you work. But so I think set that for yourself. And then it also allows, I think sometimes you get you get some really exciting work as an intern, and you get some grunt work as an intern, but if you can say at the end of it you got the lesson or that skill that you wanted for yourself, it's success. Whether it's exactly in the place that you wanted it to be, or it's in a place that sort of worked for you at the time.
So I'm not sure exactly how to ask this next question, so I'll just use myself as an example. It took me 7 years to get an undergraduate degree because it sounds like I'm a little bit unlike you in the sense that I was like, I don't even know what I want. So I guess what my question is, what would you say to our students who are like, I don't even know how to begin to start asking that question, like, what is it that I want to get out of it? I'm not sure where I'm headed with this. Do you have any advice for someone who's more like me, that's like, maybe I'll know it when I see it?
So when you could be a great researcher, and you could find out a lot about things in study, but I would say the best design comes out of things that you know and have experienced and have looked to be a part of. And I say that to say you could do a billion different things. Take a job that seemingly has nothing to do with landscape architecture, something that's maybe related but dissimilar, and take the sort of like the education from whatever that is, and use that as a landscape architecture skill. So and then I think the resulting design is more authentic and is better in that way that I just described, in that it's something that you know because you lived it. So I don't think it always has to be X number of years doing something called landscape architecture. I think it could be whatever it is, and have that inform your landscape architecture. Conversely, maybe you never want to come to something that is fully traditionally landscape, and yet using the skills that you've built in your program are really beneficial. Like I work with lots of other professionals, especially like even in my own firm now, and a lot of people just are not trained to take critique, to defend an idea, to iterate on an idea, to speak multiple languages of all the different groups that you're bringing ideas together for, and that's a completely unique skill set and beneficial in any kind of workspace. So it's helpful if you want to take diverse things and bring them into landscape architecture. That's awesome over time. And if you want to take everything you know from landscape architecture and apply it to something else, because that's what you want to do for 7 years, that is really awesome too and worthwhile.
Yeah, oh, that's beautiful. Thank you. It's funny, I had a conversation yesterday with one of my students, and we were talking about the skill of observation, like really listening and really seeing what's really there and not just what you think might be there or what you conceived was there before you even got there, is just so valuable, and it doesn't matter whether you're doing landscape architecture or anything. It's just seeing, it's seeing what's really there and then being able to learn from that in a new way. So that's beautiful.
I think that's actually the most important thing of being a landscape designer, architect, whatever, of color or Black, is that you can see it and you can speak to it. And there's so few of us who have that ability. And the communities that we're representing are large and don't have time or resources to learn how to see or be able to speak. And so we should be doing that.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, our charge. And so it's really important in any space that you take up, whether it's a firm or it's a club that you joined or whatever it might be. I think that's a value that's very unique to us and really important. I think a lot of people are relying on us, whether they know it or not, to advocate for them using those skills.
Yes. That's a perfect segue to something I wanted to bring up. It's within this kind of, it's within your conversation in the twin pandemics conversation. And I'm just going to read, this is like a series of 3 or 4 sentences that I've rearranged a little bit. But
Okay.
This is basically what you said. There is not a Black solution because we aren't a problem to fix or quiet. We are not a monolith. We've always been contributing to it, sharing in it, and building what we want to see. It is big and complex and requires a suite of solutions that allows for the nuance and variation in Black desires and needs. So this was within this bigger context of you saying, like, could we stop being so reactive and start being more proactive? Could we not have to have everything so extreme in order for anyone to even pay attention? And I just love to hear some of your thoughts on that, especially as you've started your own company now and you've really tried to use that as the place for this nexus to begin to connect all your professional skills with your more personal experience and kind of how that might be playing out. Because I think you have such a beautiful vision of like a prophet, and and just like where we could head with that. So could you just talk about that a little bit?
If I'm a prophet, then I better start playing the lotto. I will just also say, like, the it that I kept talking about, like, we've always been a part of it. It's like of America, of society here, just to add some clarity on that. I think that's just something that comes to my mind all of the time, and I think it's reflective in this idea when you see people who can't understand that Black Lives Matter is an organization and a movement at the same time. Like, there is a specific solution to or offer that you can make to an organization. That's not true of a movement, and so I think people are misunderstanding the scale of what's happening and what people are actually asking for, and it's so broad that that's why I say it's not a problem. Like, there's not one thing that you're just solving for. So that comes up in my mind all of the time, and I think I hear it in design sometimes too when people are like, okay, so what is Black architecture or what is African American design and all of those things, and they come with whatever kente cloth pattern that they found and present it to you, and you're kind of like, okay, well, obviously we have a lot of work and explaining to do here, and that's what I meant by the we've always been here, because American architecture is actually Black architecture. I think you can look to the Michelle Obama quote about our ancestors building the White House. I think it's that kind of thing, that everything that is an American problem is a Black problem, only amplified. And so there isn't one thing to offer. And I think that's kind of what design should be recognizing anyway, that there isn't one thing that you're trying to do in a space. You're trying to support every corner and every outlier so that everybody can sort of enjoy whatever it is that you've made, or you're connecting. I don't know whether it's a streetscape, so you're connecting the physical parts of their morning to the evening and the journey that they're taking, or whether it's a policy that is thinking about equal opportunities, and maybe it is the profession as a whole, and realizing that sort of that pipeline issue that I was talking to, it's not just what you can do for Black professionals, but it's what you do at every stage to expose people to design and design advocacy. So I think that's what I sort of started to try to do in my own work, whether that's at Burke or whether that's at Well Outside. It's starting to frame for people that reality that we have. You have to be solving for every problem that ails the community, because they all ail us, and that's what we want. And the solution is really big. And I think people just keep trying to shrink it down to this one quick thing because it's urgent. And I think it's sort of flipping it to say it is urgent, and that doesn't mean that you get to make it a small targeted thing. It's still a wide web.
Do you have any advice for our program in terms of how to begin to make that kind of systemic change? Beyond just we've started with this one little idea of diversity by design and trying to hook our students in. But I'd love to hear your thoughts just in terms of maybe the classes that we should be teaching, the ways in which they should be taught. Obviously, maybe a greater diversity in our faculty. By the way, we have a full-time position open in case you or someone else are interested.
I think it should be integral to every course that's there. So I think thinking about what does diversity mean and how does it show up in a technical class? How does it show up in your professional development? Can whatever you've proposed in studio, can you demonstrate how it is advancing that idea? And if it's not advancing it, can you explain why and defend that position?
So kind of like making it a systematic part of the rubric by which you evaluate the success of a design or a thought process.
Yeah, I think we take, that's innovative, and that's beautiful, and there's an equity piece, and I think it needs to be reframed to it is not innovative, or it is not beautiful, or it is not successful if that isn't fundamentally part of it.
Yeah.
So
I think probably harkens back to some of the things that you even learned back in, sustainability in the built environment, right? Because sustainability is not just the economic or the environmental, it's the social, cultural part of the equation too.
Yeah. Yep, I think that is true. I think about that all of the time when somebody's like, oh, well, this is made with XYZ material, so it's sustainable. And then you ask them, well, how long does that last? Or who does that work for? And if you find out it's like this really narrow window of things, then you're like, well, then it's not actually sustainable. And I
Yeah.
think that applies to equity as well. Like if something is meant to be sustainable, it has to be equitable and they can't exist separately. And I think design sometimes allows that to be true. I think in like an era of lead and checklists and all of those things, we allow you to just get a majority of the things right. And equity is one of those, like sometimes it shows up and that's the point you chose to pursue. I think that that's incorrect, and I think that's a great place that education could be influencing that. Like you don't get the certificate if you don't get the equity point, kind of thing.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, and it's just also just some of the basic things that we do anyway, just reminding people why that's important. Like we draw and we visualize things for people, and that could be a great equity tool. Somebody who like needs to understand something in a different way, you have that capability. Or whose neighborhoods are always flooding, or whose neighborhoods are first to be whatever, and usually it's ours. And so having that knowledge and knowing how to think about solutions for that is like a great thing that you could be offering to remedy that. Even as a student, you could be thinking about that and what you're proposing, whether it's studio or capstone or whatever.
Yeah. Beautiful. We're reaching the end of our time together, but I wanted to spend just a few minutes diving a little bit deeper into some of your work with Well Outside.
Mm-hmm.
I want to start by reading something that you've written that I've included for the students.
Mm-hmm.
Outside is a lifestyle and a hope for the future. A hope that everyone, everywhere is safe, well, and joyful outside in the landscape and outside of the boundaries we or others would place us in, professionally, socially, culturally, or otherwise. I think that's just such a beautiful mission statement. Could you just talk about that with us a little bit in terms of what that means for you and how that's starting to sort of frame out in terms of the work that you're doing or hope to be doing in the future?
Mm-hmm. Part of it was like an explanation of the name, because people were like, what does that even mean and where did that come from? And I think it's such an umbrella term because I'm like, I don't know if it's ADD or what, but I'm a person that needs like a little bit of everything from a little bit of everywhere. But I think it all falls back into this idea that no matter what part of design or policy or conversation I'm pursuing, it's towards the goal of being well outside. And I really think like I not just like okay out there or happy to be out there, but like truly well. Like I think that means that you're cared for, that you're considered, that it's okay for you to bring your wholeness to any of that. And I wanted to make that distinction that it is outside traditionally in the way that we think about landscape architecture, but it's also these boundaries that exist everywhere, whether it's your job in your office or politically or in your city or whatever it may be. And I think you want to have that same wellness, that same ability to present your whole self and your whole mind and once you're outside of those boundaries. And I think it's like a reminder to myself and hopefully to other people that you have the freedom to be beyond those boundaries. Like if you want to play within them, great, and if you want to step outside of them, that's cool too. And if you're truly well, you don't have to know everything and be prepared for everything outside of the boundary. A well system would support for your learning in that place too. So I think that's what I was talking about there, just really being able to bring what you know and learn what you don't in the landscape and sort of beyond that.
Yeah. Well, there's another thing here that I wanted to kind of bring up. You talked about affecting change through action and project-based learning as kind of another one of the touchstones for what you'd like to accomplish in Well Outside. Could you just talk a little bit about that and what that might look like?
Yeah. I'm just so bored of people like their equity thing is just something they say, and especially in a profession like ours, which is a profession of doing. So the words don't actually mean anything to me unless you're also moving through those in action, especially as a landscape designer or architect or whatever have you. Like if you actually meant it, you would be doing it and designing it and building it. And I also think that equity work to get real traction, it has to also have economic value. And I think that's how companies think about it. I think that's how cities respond to it. Like, do we have budget for it, or do we have, how are we applying that to the project? And so I think that's what I mean by like project-based learning. Like, okay, apply this to something that has dollars. And so you've made the statement and then you've decided to take action, and then your action needs to sort of apply to a project so that it could then start to, whether it's at an experimental level or it starts to set precedent, or it sort of shows that this makes not only community sense, but it makes economic sense, and we start to put money where your mouth is kind of thing. I think the reparations concept gets stuck at this idea of like writing a check, but I also think that it's deliberate and intentional investment into projects in action.
Wow. So, not to put you on the spot, but if you had a dream job come up for the next year or two as part of your work in Well Outside, and how you think you could make the most impact through your work over the next several years, could you describe that to us? Like, what might that look like?
Hmm.
Like a big dream of, like, wouldn't it be cool if?
Yeah. It would be really cool if there was a space that felt like it was mine, and not just because I claimed it, but because it was designed for me. And I don't think that I see a lot of that. I think that there's just places that I respond positively to, but that's serendipitous. It's not that it was intentionally thought about. And I would like those to be spread out. I think like it should be beyond the scale of just a signature project, but it should be anywheresville, USA, that you can find a place that is that it's for you on
Yeah.
purpose.
Yeah, oh, that's beautiful. That's funny because well, not funny, but it's interesting. Last week we talked with Kofi Boone, who's one of the faculty members at NC State in their landscape architecture program, and he wrote an article recently called "Black Landscapes Matter," and that was one of the points that he was trying to make in that article. I think was, like, let's really pay attention to how to really respond to different people in different ways, rather than, once again, it's that idea of kind of one size fits all, which often tends to be sort of the white middle class, upper middle class concept of what should be.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have some parting words for our students in terms of any advice you would give them? I mean, you've already given some beautiful advice just out of your own example of how you worked your way through school and all the different work experiences you had. But we'd love to hear any thoughts you have in closing about, some advice or ways you think would be helpful for our students to move forward, especially to our seniors, but there are a few juniors in the class as well.
Yeah, that's a big question. I think advocate for yourself always. That's something that I wish people said to me more. Like, don't be afraid to reach out or to ask a question or to follow up if it makes something better for you. I think I think be okay with trying a few things out. I think there's like a lot of pressure to always get it right, and whether that's picking the right job or the right next step. Maybe you're thinking grad school, or maybe you're thinking about B Corps, whatever. I think just like we iterate in design, I think you should allow for some of that in your life. I think whether you're in a position of privilege or in great need, you still have something that you can give, and I think that it feels one, it's really important to do, but I think it's also like you can be a little bit selfish. That feels good. I think that's something you want to always be doing when you're moving through your professional life, because there are seasons that are great and there are seasons that are tough, but like having that feeling of knowing that you've given something is nice, and you can sort of track that, and that's been important to me. I think have a few things in your basket that are moving at different time scales. So maybe your volunteerism is something that you can see the fruits of in a month, whereas whatever you're working on at work is like a 5-year process before you see the fruits of that labor. At least for me, it's important to like get some feedback intermittently. So I take on a few things that are moving at different time scales. So there's sort of a result just be a part of, and you're not just always in a space of waiting. Take the opportunity that you're given in school. Like, for example, this series, wow, what a great time to just follow up with a little email about, hey, I have this question now that I heard you talk, and you've gotten the introduction that your school's giving you. Like, use that. If you are really interested in something, talk to the professors who are focused on that, whether they're in your specific college or they're like somewhere else in the university, or they don't exist where you are. Ask a professor, like, do you know somebody who's really working on this and can help me? Because I think that's okay too. Like, we are generalists as landscape architects, but it's okay if there's something you're really passionate about. And it also doesn't have to look like what other people are passionate about. There's space for you in practice. Sometimes you just have to make it for yourself. And tell people like who you are and what you have to offer. I think there's a time to be humble, but it's not right now. Like this, I think in the same way that this is the time for me to build my business, it's the time for you to build your brand. And a lot of opportunities don't come just not because people don't know you, know what you're gonna do. And sometimes the onus is on you to show them and tell them. So I think brand yourself that way as somebody who's gonna get after it and who can be humble but wants to let somebody know like where you came from, what you've overcome, and what you're hoping to do. I think those would be my tips. And sleep, like I don't know what your program looks like, but that was hard to come by, and there actually is no value in you staying up forever doing something that you're kind of only sort of doing. You might as well be sleeping. I had to learn that at work as well. I'm like, what am I really doing in this drafting program at 3 a.m.? I don't know. So that's not valuable? Like, just think about that a little bit. Like, when you're making a contribution, be able to see what that contribution is. Otherwise, you might need to reevaluate whether that's the role that you're in, why you're staying up, all of those things. I think just make sure that it's providing a value. And so I said all of that. So I said you should follow up with people. So I'll make that offer that if you want to shoot me an email or just set up a time to call because you're over looking at these screens or whatever. I'm open to that. I'm definitely a person that has to like walk away from a conversation and marinate on it for a while before I have an idea. So I will sort of make that offer to you that if you think of something later or you want feedback on your work or ideas for next steps, that I'm happy to talk about it with you or point you in the direction. And I think you should take that up with people. Maybe it's not me whose vision aligns with yours, but you've seen that person. I think you should take that opportunity.
Giselle, so many words of wisdom and insight. Thank you so much. I'm going to open the floor and see if there's any of our students that would like to take that opportunity right now to ask you anything. Is there anyone listening in that would like to contribute in some way or ask a question?
I think you asked most of the questions for us.
Okay.
It was a lot of information, but it was interesting. I think I like Jescelle the most as our speaker because she's younger, close to our age.
Uh-huh.
So she can give us that real sense of, I guess, what we would go through just coming out of college.
Yeah. And what a role model, huh?
Yeah.
Her get-to-itiveness and putting it all together in such beautiful ways. It's been a real pleasure to talk with you, Jescelle.
Thanks for having me.
Anyone else like to say anything before we sign off? Okay, well, I've shared your email with everyone. Do you want me to share your phone number as well? Or
Sure.
not? Okay.
You can share it. I don't answer numbers I don't know, so you should probably shoot me a text message first. Tell me why I should be picking up the phone, but other than that, yeah.
Good. Well, we'll be really happy to see kind of where you head over the next few years. We'll be watching you and seeing all the interesting, cool things that you're doing. And it'll be fun, too, to hopefully have some of our students be able to stay in touch with you. We sure hope that you'll stay in touch with our program in general. We have so much to.
I'd love to.
Okay. Thank you very much, Giselle. I really appreciate your time today, your insights. Bye.